Alright, in this video I will be replacing the rear sway bar end links on my 2012 Nissan Pathfinder. These are Moog parts, rear right passenger side K750038 and rear left or driver's side is K750037, and I got both parts from Rock Auto. And you can see I wrote the torque spec down as 67 foot-pounds for the bolts, and the price from Rock Auto for these Moog stabilizer bar end links or sway bar end links, $20. I got the jack under there already. It is on an axle stand, and I got some Hail Mary wood packing under the vehicle as well, since you got to lay down under there and wrench away. I don't actually use those hex bits. I use the wrenches, I use the sockets, I use the breaker bar, I use the secondary jack, and I use a ton of the penetrant spray, which has been cooking on these bolts for a while, and obviously you just keep spraying them down. So you can see the rear stabilizer bar end links there. There's the lower nut on the passenger side one, and the upper one is a little hard to see, hard to film because of the focus. The upper one's right there. So these are the Moog parts. They do take the 6mm hex or Allen key. If you want to use it, you don't have to. So that's one way to keep the bolt from spinning while you're tightening the nut on. And the nut is a 17mm nut. And I actually prefer the Moog ones over the OEM ones. The OEM ones aren't particularly expensive either. But that right there is actually a 19mm, which is a little bit more common. And the OEM ones have a 24mm bolt on the back, so I had to go buy a specialty wrench to get them off because the adjustable wrench was inadequate for the job. So like I said, I did start off with an adjustable wrench. Eventually I will break down and go to the store and buy a 24mm wrench for these because they're so tight with rust that it becomes very difficult to get them off. So the nuts on these ones are also a 17mm nut. I found that you don't necessarily need the breaker bar to get these things moving. However, you definitely don't want like a short stubby wrench or something. You need something with good leverage to get that moving. And another angle. My recommendation is actually to do the top nut first, and that's what I do on the driver's side, but for this one I did the bottom first. And the only reason I would recommend doing the top nut first is that it just sort of pulls the lower one on a funny angle, and it makes it more difficult to hold the nut on the back side where the adjustable wrench is right now. So about halfway through getting that nut off, I broke down and went to Canadian Tire and got a 24mm wrench because the adjustable was slipping, because that nut, you can see it's on an angle there, caused the adjustable wrench to be unable to grip the nut properly. And you could also see that I've put a jack underneath, and that took a little bit of pressure off the lower one as well. I end up cutting that nut off the lower one just because it was so frozen on with rust. So for the upper one, I do a little bit more work with the penetrant spray and the metal wire brush just to make the threads a little cleaner. So you can see I got the 24mm in there for the upper bolt as well. And that one just pins against some of the suspension components, and then I'm using again the 17mm to back that nut off. This one wasn't nearly as bad as the lower nut to remove. And just working with the two wrenches, it wasn't too bad. If you have a smaller socket, once you get that nut moving, you'll be able to get it off without a whole lot of issue. But I would definitely recommend getting a wire brush or something just to clean off any rust, just because it became so difficult to turn that lower one. To cut it off, I used a Dremel tool with a small cutoff wheel and took the nut off in a couple of minutes of grinding. Obviously the Dremel's not a super powerful grinder, but it'll get through it. And to avoid the problem I had with the lower nut, I do continually hit these with the penetrant spray just to help keep things lubricated and moving. The biggest challenge with getting these off is just how awkward it is and the limited space you have to work with. So there's the passenger side one completely off. Once the bolts are out, these things just sort of fall out. But you can see just how floppy that is. It doesn't really take any pressure in any direction to make it bounce around. And there's the nut that I cut off. Basically, I just made two cuts on the nut with the Dremel tool, and it came off without any issue. And there's the new one. I don't really think there's any difference. It's not like the new one's a beefier design or anything like that. It's pretty equivalent, but I do like that it has a 19 millimeter on the back because it's just easier to get that wrench in there. But you can see how much stiffer that these new ones are as compared to the old ones, which just sort of flop around. And there's just one more example of how floppy they were, as compared to a new one which doesn't move at all when you hold it out. And there's a better view of where you're putting your wrench on the back side of the OEM ones. And like I said, that is a 24 millimeter wrench. If you don't have a 24, I would recommend you go get one and not use a adjustable wrench, as I had initially thought might work. To put these in, I do find that it is beneficial to have another jack just to lift up the suspension a little bit, and that'll help bring things a little bit closer together. Obviously, you'll need to move the end link around a little bit until it fits through both of the holes, but quite frankly, it's not very difficult. And with the end link in place, obviously just thread the nuts on by hand, and then sort of the same deal. You get the wrench on the back side of the nut so it keeps it from moving around. Just find some area of the vehicle to pin it into, which is, obviously avoiding things like brake lines, stuff like that. Just looking for those hard chunks of metal that will support the wrench. And then get on the back side with either the wrench or the socket and tighten the nut down. So you can see for the upper, I'm using some of the suspension components, whereas for the lower, I was using a braking component. And then again, just 17 millimeter on these Moog parts. Now, like I said, the torque spec I'm using is 67 foot-pounds. Again, with the box end wrench in place, and then just using the torque wrench to bring it to the 67 foot-pounds. So this is for the lower one. The lower one's easier than the upper one. And this is the upper one. You can see it's going through that horseshoe in the lower suspension components. There's not a lot of room with this really large torque wrench, but it does work. Basically, you get one or two clicks of the ratchet in there each time you move it up and down before it hits the either the top or bottom of that suspension horseshoe. Okay, so this is the driver's side. For this one, like I said, I am going to do the upper first. For this one, I am using a Dremel with a wire brush to clean up the threads so there's no rust or dirt, debris, whatever, stuck in those threads, and ideally keep the nut from getting jammed up. So like I said, I am going to do the upper one first because the doing the lower one first didn't work out well for me the other time, and quite frankly, doing the upper one on the driver's side worked out well. Again, just get the wrench in place, and I'm using a combination of breaker bars, ratchets, and 17 millimeter wrenches to get the nut off. So there's the top bolt out, and obviously again it's super floppy. And I do once again use the jack to lift up the suspension on the rear driver's side. So now I'm going to move on to the lower bolt. So I got the 24 millimeter wrench in there again, and for this one I'm just using a socket this time, 17 millimeter. And not a whole lot of space to work, but again, 2 or 3 clicks per cycle, and it takes a little while to get that one off, but eventually it comes off as well, and I do not need to cut it. You also have an option to get a 17 millimeter wrench in there. I found the breaker bars, other than breaking them loose, were quite inconvenient just because there's not enough space to work in there with the breaker bar. So there's the driver's side, same as the passenger side, very floppy. Nothing really left to these things. And once again, for the install, really you're just lining them up to the 2 holes and putting them in place where the old ones were. Not a whole lot to it, but like I said, it is beneficial to have a secondary jack just to lift the suspension components up a bit. And just like the other one, I'll put the nuts on by hand, then I'll use the 19 millimeter wrench this time and the 17 millimeter to tighten the bolts. And just like before, just find a good chunk of frame to pin the wrench against, trying to avoid things like brake lines. And for the upper nut, I actually use the coil suspension to hold the wrench in place. Once I have both nuts reasonably tight, but not to torque spec, I then break out the torque wrench. Once again, 67 foot-pounds, just making sure that they get torqued down correctly. And just like the other side, the lower nut is much easier to torque to spec. The upper nut has that, again, same issue where you have to kind of feed it through this horseshoe. And just like the other side, there's not a whole lot of room, but you can get 1 or 2 clicks out of the ratchet in there. And in the end, I guess that's all you really need. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And once those sway bar end links are torqued to spec, I'll take the lug nuts, get the wheels back on, and lower the vehicle. So the price breakdown for this job was $54 for parts from Rock Auto plus 15 shipping. That's all in Canadian dollars. So that came to a total of $70 for the DIY. And when I called Nissan, the part cost they quoted me was $115 for the 2 stabilizer bar end links. That's $35 each, but they don't come with the bolts. The bolts cost another $32 for the 4 bolts, for a grand total of $115.20 after tax. The labor charge that Nissan quoted me to install both of them was 0.7 hours, so obviously it depends on your labor rate. Here in Ontario, the quote was $109 plus tax to install, so that is about $235 if you went to the dealership to have this done. So obviously $235 minus 70, the DIY savings for this project were about $165 Canadian. Obviously I needed to go buy a 24mm wrench, which cost about $12. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.